Hey there, in this session, you're going to learn about the science of data visualization and how you can use a better understanding to bring your data analysis to life and tell better stories. This is an important skill on the job as a data person. You need to be able to find the insights, but you also need to be able to tell those stories and get your partners in the business to take action. Today, you're going to learn how to do just that. It's going to be a lot of fun. Stick around, and I know you're going to enjoy this one.
I am so excited for this session. Data visualization and storytelling is what got me into the world of data analytics from day one. A lot of people think of data as this very cut and dry quantitative field, but when you think about it, creativity actually plays such an important role in being a great analyst. And data visualization and dashboard design and storytelling is such a great way to showcase that creativity. And for me, that was a huge draw into the world of analytics. I fell in love with this concept of bringing data to life and telling stories. And this presentation I'll share with you today really encapsulates some of my biggest learning lessons and tips and techniques and things like that. So what I'll cover, some of you may have seen before. I've delivered a very similar presentation in the past. We cover a lot of these slides and cases in a few of our courses, like Thinking Like an Analyst and Advanced Excel Dashboard Design. But I really love presenting it live because I'm going to try to keep the engagement going. I'm going to try to keep some time for Q&A so that we can spark a dialogue around some of these topics, which, to be honest, I could probably talk about for the entire day. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen and we can jump right in. Data visualization and storytelling. I'm going to start with something that some of you may have seen before. It's called the 10-second rule, and I think it's the single best demonstration that proves how valuable data visualization is. So what I'm going to do is show you some data on the screen, no cheating if you've seen this before. And what you're going to do is try to gather as much information about that data, as much meaningful insight as you possibly can. All right, ready? Go. All right, time's up. So how did that feel? Probably like a pretty tight time span, right? There wasn't a ton of data. It was less than 100 data points on the screen. But in 10 seconds, there's really not much information you can gather, right? So now I'm going to show you the same information presented visually. I'm going to start the 10-second timer again, and I want to go through that same exercise. Try to glean as much information and insight as you possibly can. Ready? Go. All right, so that's time. How did it feel that time? Right? Hopefully you're able to gather much more information, much more quickly. And the reason why is when you visualize this data set, those patterns and trends start to emerge much, much more clearly, right? We see that product A is steadily growing, but saw a big dip in month 6. Product B follows a kind of logistic curve. It's kind of flattened out in the last couple months. Product C saw a huge spike in month 11. And product D in yellow seems to follow kind of a quarterly seasonal pattern. So this is a variation of something called Anscombe's quartet, a really interesting experiment that basically shows you that even though these 4 series share a lot of the same descriptive statistics, they all tell very different, very distinct stories when you actually visualize them. Now, here's another example, and I think it brings up an important point, which is that data visualization isn't all about fancy charts or pretty visuals, right? And I want to give you one more example that helps make this case. So imagine you're looking at a report with 8 different metrics. Which of these metrics deserves your attention right now? You just don't know, right? We don't have any context. There's 8 different metrics. We don't know what's good, what's bad. Now consider if it looks like this. Just by using simple visual attributes, things like font color and weight, icons, we're bringing emphasis and commanding attention to the exact data points that we need our audience to pay attention to, right? With just those small design tweaks, no charts, no graphs, no other visuals, immediately the audience knows that something's wrong with metric 3, and we should probably keep a close eye on metric 5. This is another great example of some of the cues and some of the techniques that you can leverage in the world of data visualization to tell a much clearer, more powerful story. So that brings us into kind of the science of data viz. And when you think about how humans have evolved and how the human brain works, we aren't designed as creatures to interpret and deal with raw data. It's been millions and millions of years before data was even a thing. So our brains haven't evolved to really optimize how we interpret things like this. So what we need are clear patterns. We need visual cues to help us very quickly make sense of complex information. And so in the front of our brain, we have something called the prefrontal cortex. This is where we do cognitive functioning, problem solving. It's slow and conscious thinking. And this is what we're putting to use when we're trying to make sense of non-visual information, like raw tabular data. The back of our brain, we have the visual cortex. This is where we do our visual perception and understanding. It's instantaneous, it's subconscious, it's how we understand things like color, patterns, shapes, relative sizes, things like that. Now, what's amazing about data visualization is that you're putting both your prefrontal cortex and your visual cortex to work, which essentially combines that power of cognition, which is slow and conscious, with perception, which is instantaneous. And that scientifically is why this works so well. So I want to share some definitions to make sure we're kind of on the same page here. Data visualization, as the textbook definition goes, is the graphical representation of data and information. As we like to say, it's what brings data to life. Now, we're also going to spend some time talking about data storytelling as well, which is an extension of data visualization that's really more focused on crafting narratives designed to communicate insights, influence decisions, or support specific data-driven recommendations. John mentioned you're going to hear from Christopher Chin later today. This is his sweet spot, his bread and butter. Highly recommend checking out that session. It's going to be fantastic. Now, what better way to explain these definitions and concepts than by visualizing them? All right, so here's a table of raw data. It contains US music industry revenue broken down by physical and digital formats, trended out by year. It's not super complicated, but it does definitely take some time to dig in and interpret what's going on here, right? Here's that same data set visualized using a stacked column chart, which makes it very easy to see both the overall revenue trend as well as that shifting composition between physical and digital formats. And if we take that one step further, here's the data presented with a story. So digital revenue climbed steadily since the iTunes launch in 2003, but overall industry revenue is down 50% compared to the peak in 1999. So here we're introducing tools like text, like data labels, visual callouts to really focus the reader's attention on a very specific narrative rather than having them look at the chart and draw their own conclusions. And this is an extremely powerful tool when it's done well, especially when it comes to conducting explanatory analyses or when you're presenting insights and recommendations to your stakeholders. So when it comes to deciding how to visualize a data set or which specific chart to use, it's really important to ask yourself 3 questions. Number 1, what type of data are you working with? Number 2, what exactly are you trying to communicate? And number 3, arguably most important, who is the audience and what do they need? So we're going to unpack each of these questions in a little bit more depth. Starting with question 1, what type of data are you working with? So there are all sorts of flavors of data out there, common ones like time series, geospatial, categorical, hierarchical, but you might come across some more unique and specialized data types as well. Things like financial statements, text data, funnel stages, survey responses, things like that. And really the key takeaway here is that the type of data you're working with often helps determine which type of visual will best represent it, right? Common examples are using maps for geospatial analysis, line charts for time series data, bar or column charts for categorical comparisons, and then really like only using specialized examples like waterfall charts if you have financial balances that you want to illustrate, Likert scales for survey responses, word clouds even for textual data, things like that. But bottom line, understanding the data that you're working with is the first step when it comes to choosing a visual. Second question, what do you want to communicate? This could be a comparison, a composition, a distribution, a relationship. And I want to unpack kind of each of these types of communication in turn, starting with comparison visuals. As the name suggests, these are used to compare values either over time or more commonly across categories. So common visuals here include variations of bar and column charts, along with line or area charts if you're showing time series. You might have less common examples like funnel charts to show sequential stages as well. Composition visuals, these are used to break down the component parts of a whole. This is where you'll typically use stacked bar or column charts, pie or donut charts, which I have a hunch that might come up in the Q&A later today. Is a pie chart ever an appropriate type of visual to use? I have my opinion on that one. You can also show things like stacked area charts here to show composition over time, and maybe even things like tree maps or sunbursts if you're dealing with hierarchical data. Next up, you've got distribution visuals. This is when you want to show the frequency of values within a series. And by far the most common and effective visual for showing this is the histogram, but there are others as well, like the box and whisker plot, density plots, heat maps, things like that. And then finally, last but not least, you've got relationship visuals. This is all about showing correlation between multiple numerical visuals or variables, typically done using scatter plots or bubble charts. You might also use things like a heat map or correlation matrix here as well. Now, I want to pause here because I'm talking a lot and throwing a lot of terms and terminology and chart types at you. And you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed just given how many types of visuals are out there. So this is the point where I like to pause and try to give you some peace of mind, which is that 90% of the time, basic variations of bar charts, column charts, and line charts will be the simplest and clearest way to visualize your data. So my advice to you, if there's one thing you take away from this entire presentation, keep it simple. Avoid using complex or custom visuals unless you absolutely need to. And most importantly, make sure to prioritize simplicity and clarity over aesthetics and design. That takes us to our third and final question. Who is the audience and what do they need? Now, one of the most common mistakes that we see people make in our data challenges and in our courses is that they design based on what they want to build, not what their audience needs to see. And that's a big miss because designing effective visuals requires a level of empathy. You need to understand who your audience is. You need to understand what motivates them, what they're looking for. That's really going to drive the types of visuals you use and how you kind of craft the narrative. So consider 3 different example audiences here, kind of encapsulating the whole spectrum. The analyst is someone who's going to want detail, right? If you're presenting to a data analyst, a data scientist, a peer, they're going to like to understand what's going on at a granular level. So they're likely to respond pretty well to things like data tables or combo charts with enough detail to support root cause analysis, right? You don't really need to dumb it down or, use extremely simplified chart types for the analyst audience. Now, for a manager, managers will typically want more summarized data that leads to clear insights to help them operate the business. And for a manager level audience, typically it's best to stick with the more common charts and graphs and only include enough detail to support specific insights or recommendations. And then finally, you've got the executive audience. The executive, the C-level exec, is going to need high-level, crystal clear KPIs that help them track business health and top-line performance. Things like KPI cards or very, very simple charts with minimal detail unless it adds critical context to those metrics. So bottom line here, how you choose to visualize and present your data is very much a function of who will be consuming it. Analysts or data specialists might want to see that granular detail or more complex charts, while managers or execs often prefer higher level metrics with a focus on clear data-driven insights. So I want to take just a minute and share this view of what I would consider essential visuals. This is something I talk about quite a bit. I've posted about this recently. Going back to my comment earlier about trying to keep it simple, I will say that these 8 visuals should cover 99% of data viz use cases. And again, unless you're dealing with something much more niche or more specialized, this is where I would focus your attention, especially if you're relatively new to data or new to visualization or storytelling. Bar and column charts are fantastic for showing any sort of categorical comparisons. Line charts for time series, stacked bars or columns when you want to show composition across multiple categories. Again, I'm a big fan of the donut chart when it's used properly. It can be a really clear and nice way to visualize composition as parts of a whole, especially when you're dealing with a very small number of segments and where precision isn't really critical. Area charts are a great way to show composition over time, maps for geospatial, scatter plots for relationships, and sometimes nothing beats a table or a matrix formatted as a heat map. That can be a great way to show kind of high-level numerical patterns that might be difficult to capture in another type of visual. So we've got this slide available. It's in the course downloads for, I think, several of our courses. Data Literacy Foundations, maybe Thinking Like an Analyst. If not, we can share this PDF out with anyone who wants it. But go ahead, print this out, tack it up on your cube wall, and remember that these are going to get you 99% of the way there for most types of data visualization cases. So this is probably my favorite slide of the deck because up to this point, we've been really honing in on data visualization best practices, but sometimes it can be really helpful to take a look at worst practices too. So I want to talk about some of the most common visualization mistakes that we tend to see, and more importantly, how we might suggest fixing them. So first up, the wrong chart type. This is a really common mistake. We often see things like people using line charts to show categorical comparisons, or tree maps when a simple bar chart would be ideal. In this case, we're using a pie chart to show quarterly data. Technically, it's not incorrect, but assuming that we're interested in understanding that trend over time, using a column or a line chart, kind of like this one, would show that much more clearly. Next up, lack of focus. Here we've got a line chart with a ton of different series plotted to the point where it just looks like spaghetti on the page, right? So this is technically the correct type of visual, right? We're looking at trends over time, but it doesn't communicate any clear pattern or purpose. So in cases like this, it can be helpful to either remove series that don't contribute to the analysis or use selective color like this to draw attention to the lines or data points that matter most. Next up, we've got noise and distractions. Really common mistake that we see. This is stuff like 3D formats, animations, background images, and so on. Again, the simple mantra to remember with this one is that if it doesn't add value, it doesn't belong in the visual. In this case, we've got a pretty horrendous 3D pie chart here. We're pulling out all the stops, all the worst practices. We've got 3D effects. We're using the beveled edge effect, which is just totally unnecessary. We've got exploding segments. It's rotated in 3D. It's just like over the top bad, right? And this is a good reminder that just because a feature exists doesn't mean you have to use it, right? So sticking with a simple 2D donut chart like this, in this case, would do just fine. Next up is a pretty common one that we often see in our public data challenges, prioritizing form over function, right? Aesthetics over clarity. And that essentially just means picking charts based on what would look really cool on a poster, as opposed to what communicates the information most clearly. So here we've got a sunburst chart that shows employees by team and office, which looks pretty sweet, but it's actually pretty tough to interpret. So for something like this, maybe you don't visualize that data at all, if a simple table like this provides all the information that you need. And then finally, here's a devious one, misleading narrative, which is about exaggerating trends or patterns to make them appear more dramatic or significant than they actually are. So take a look at this column chart here, comparing some sort of result for men and women. And when you look at this at a glance, clearly the data skews heavily towards males, right? But actually, that's not the case. In this case, the y-axis has been truncated so much that it makes fractions of a percentage look massive. And watch what happens when we reset that y-axis to start from 0. Now the real story emerges, which is that there's really no significant difference between genders at all. Last but not least, missing context. This one's pretty straightforward, right? Here we've got a dual axis chart, but it's impossible to tell what's what. There's no chart title, there's no legend, no axis labels to help us match each series to the correct values. So the obvious fix here is to simply add those chart elements like so to make sure your readers can follow along. So hopefully that's helpful. Those are 6 of the most common data visualization mistakes that we tend to see and some techniques to avoid them. All right, next up, let's talk about the role of context when it comes to data visualization and storytelling. Whenever you're presenting or visualizing data, remember that context is key. It's what gives those numbers meaning, and it's what helps your users interpret them accurately. So imagine that you're a manager, you're sitting in your office, and one of your analysts drops a report on your desk that looks like this. Hey boss, we had 690 October transactions. So what, right? The problem is that this is simply a data point, which in isolation means very little. There's no value here. And to interpret what this number, 690 transactions, actually means, we need to understand things like how that number is changing over time. How does it compare against previous periods? Is it going up? Is it going down? Did we beat our benchmark? Is it better or worse than our forecasts? Things like that. That's going to give us the context that helps us understand and interpret this number as good or bad. So now consider this version of the report. Here we're showing that same KPI value, right? 690 transactions, but also adding reference labels to compare that value against last month, last year, and our forecast or target. We're also using line charts to show that trend over time. We're drawing attention to high and low points using selective chart labels and markers. And we're showing multiple lines so that we can address year-over-year comparisons here as well. Just packing so much more context into this view. And as a result, we're able to draw some pretty substantial conclusions, right? There were 690 transactions in October. That's down 4% versus last month, but we're still up 9% year over year. We beat our target in September and October after falling short in August, seeing an upward trend this year with a significant peak in July. And based on seasonality, we can expect to have a strong November and December. So remember that anytime you share data, it's critical to think about how you can add this type of context to make it truly meaningful. All right, so up to this point, we've been talking about data visualization strictly in terms of individual charts and visuals. So now I want to broaden the scope a little bit and talk about data storytelling and dashboard design. And we cover this in a lot more depth in other courses. In fact, there are entire books written on the subject, but I want to touch upon it really quickly today because it's such an important aspect of communicating with data. So you'll often see data storytelling in action in the context of things like ad hoc reports and presentations or explanatory dashboards. And when we use that term dashboard, what we're talking about are tools that are designed to consolidate data across multiple sources, to track key metrics and information, and most importantly, ultimately to facilitate data-driven decision-making. And when we teach data storytelling and dashboard design skills, we like to break it down into a 6-step process, right? It starts with defining the purpose. This involves asking questions like who's the audience, what are their goals, what questions they need answers to, things like that. Step 2 is about choosing the right metrics, which is about making sure that the data you're presenting directly aligns with that purpose and those business goals, and that the level of detail is appropriate for your audience. Step 3 is about presenting that data effectively and selecting the right types of visuals for the job. Step 4, eliminating clutter and noise. Talked about this, right? Getting rid of anything that adds noise, doesn't add value, things like 3D formats, excessive color. We see tons of people using really loud background images, which again, they kind of look cool, but they distract from the real story at hand. And one of my favorite quotes in context of this step here, which I think applies quite well to data visualization, is perfection is not achieved, or sorry, I messed it up. Perfection is achieved when there's nothing more, not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. That's from Antoine Saint-Exupéry, I think. And it was originally spoken in the context of engineering, but again, I think it actually applies quite well to data storytelling as well. Step 5 is about using layout to focus attention. This is a really interesting one where you kind of combine a lot of art and science. This can involve using things like Gestalt design principles, like proximity and enclosure, to group related elements on the dashboard canvas. It involves using attributes like size and color and emphasis to draw attention to specific patterns or data points, kind of like that metric example I shared at the very beginning of the presentation. And it's also about leveraging common reading patterns like Z or F patterns to create a logical flow and make sure your audience is seeing the most important information first. Finally, step 6 is about packaging everything into a clear story. This is where a little text can go a long way, and where things like descriptive chart titles and data labels can really help you craft a clear narrative. So that's our design framework. Over these next kind of 10 minutes or so, what I want to do is really try to bring this to life with an end-to-end example so that you can get a sense of what this framework and this process looks like in action. So here's the situation. Imagine you've just been hired as a BI analyst for Maven Toys. It's a nationwide chain of toy stores. Your assignment is to design an explanatory dashboard for regional sales managers to help them understand how their regions are performing. They're going to review it every month, and they need information on revenue trends, product level performance, and lost revenue due to inventory shortages. And our objectives, basically, we're going to run through those 6 steps that we just talked about. So step 1, defining the purpose. Who's the audience? What are their goals? What questions they need answers to? How often will the dashboard be reviewed? These are the types of questions you're asking at this phase. Luckily, we have all this information in our project brief, but in reality, you'll likely gather this information through ongoing conversations with the stakeholders themselves. So in this case, who's the audience? Regional sales managers. What are their business goals and objectives? They want to increase revenue and minimize revenue loss due to lack of inventory. What questions might they need answers to? Things like, how is revenue trending? Which products are performing best and worst in my region? Are there products that are out of stock in certain locations? And then finally, how often is this dashboard going to be reviewed? Once a month. So that's step 1. We've kind of defined the purpose. We understand why we're building this dashboard in the first place. That takes us to step 2. Now that we have a clear picture of our business goals, we can start thinking about which specific metrics to include and at what level of detail or granularity makes the most sense. So a little pro tip here, creating a table like this to actually map your metrics against each business goal is a fantastic way to document your thought process. And you might even add some metric definitions here as well, start building a proper data dictionary. This can be a really smart thing to do, especially if you're working with complex or industry-specific metrics, or if you're building reports or dashboards that are going to be shared throughout the organization. This is a fantastic artifact that will really help you stand out and help people understand, your thought process and exactly how your report is built. So for the business goal of increasing revenue, some metrics we might want to include things like total revenue by month, by region, by category at all different levels. We'll want to see month over month and year over year change so we can add that context behind the revenue. And that, again, is going to help make the numbers mean something so that our end users know how to interpret and react to them. For the goal of minimizing loss due to lack of inventory, we'd want to be able to track stock on hand at the product level for each store and try to estimate the monthly revenue loss based on what we would have expected to sell had those products been in stock. Now, keep in mind, I'm going through this really quickly. I'm making it seem very, very simple and obvious, which it is absolutely not. This is not a black and white exercise. It's not something that you're going to get right on the first pass. In reality, you'll likely iterate and evolve this list again and again as you start designing your dashboard, and more importantly, as you start getting actual feedback from your stakeholders. So we've completed step 2, right? We know the goals, the purpose. Now we have a good sense of what metrics we need to support those goals. So step 3 is figuring out how to present that data effectively. So here we can take all that information from step 2, all of those metrics at all those levels of detail, and start thinking about the best way to visually represent them, right? So for revenue by month, probably a line chart, right? Revenue by region, which is probably the single most important number that these regional managers care about. Maybe we use a KPI card, right, to really give it that emphasis. Revenue by category could be a bar chart, product level details, maybe a table. We can continue this thought process through the whole list and come up with something like this. Again, this is another case where I'm making it look very simple. I'm moving through this quickly, but in reality, you're going to iterate many, many times before you land on this final version. You'll likely go back to step 2, even step 1, until you get to that final product. So really don't stress too much about this on your first pass. So we're on to step 4, right? Let's see what this would look like if we just took all those visuals in our list from step 3 and just dumped them on the canvas here, right? We'd end up with something that looks like this. Technically, we've checked all the boxes, right? We've defined a clear purpose. We've chosen the right metrics and effective charts, but obviously our work is not done. It's cluttered, it's noisy, there's no intuitive layout or flow here. And now it's time to leverage some of those visualization and storytelling best practices that we've been talking about, starting with eliminating clutter and noise. So there are a lot of very simple things we can do here that will go a long way in terms of simplicity and polish. So for example, looking at that line chart right in the middle of the canvas there, we could update that revenue line chart to simplify the axis and data labels. We could remove the grid lines and the border, change the colors to draw more attention to the current year, which might look something like this. We could apply similar changes to the product and category bar charts beneath this line chart. Also use color a little bit more strategically to draw attention to positive or negative trends, like this. One thing to note here, we're using red and green. If you want to be a little bit more sensitive to those who are colorblind, combinations of blue and orange tend to be a little bit better for showing positive and negative trends. But now looking at our product tables on the right, it seems pretty simple, but there are some techniques that we could apply to make those tables much cleaner as well, like killing the borders, adjusting text alignment, maybe adding some conditional formatting to really focus on which products are driving gains and losses, like so. So that's feeling much better already, even with just a handful of relatively simple tweaks. So with that, we're on to step 5, right? Now we're talking about how we can assemble these visuals into an intuitive layout that helps us craft a narrative and make sure we're focusing viewers' attention in the right places. So in most Western cultures, viewers typically start at the top left of the page up here. They scan to the right, then make their way down the page from left to right, following either a Z pattern, which looks like this, or an F pattern, which is similar and looks like this. Either way, the point is to feature the most important high-level information towards the left and the top of your canvas. So with that in mind, one thing we might tweak right away is rearranging our header to put the dashboard title in the top left and bump that logo, which is less important, to the right of the page, like so. And for the rest of our visuals, let's start by kind of clearing the deck here and see if we can improve that layout and flow. Also practice applying some of those design principles that we've been talking about. So given that the top business objective is focused on revenue growth, it makes sense to put our revenue KPI cards and trending charts right there in the prime real estate on that left side of the canvas. You can see we've also played with things like font size and color to emphasize that current month number and de-emphasize the month over month and year over year figures, since those are really just providing that additional context. Note we're also using kind of a subtle design principle known as enclosure here, that kind of shaded box in the background that visually groups these elements together since they're part of the same revenue story. And we want users to really focus attention here before they shift their attention away to other charts. Another best practice is to start high level and progressively get more granular as you move through the dashboard. So with that, let's pull in our category level bar charts next. We're going to put those right here. And if you look closely, you'll see that we actually removed the axis labels from the revenue change chart, and we've aligned the two closely together to create something called continuity between them. This is another example of a Gestalt design principle that we're putting to use, and another way that we can remove unnecessary ink from the page. So now we're getting more granular, right? We're getting down to the product level, so we can pull in our top 5 and bottom 5 product tables like so. And because everything so far has been revenue focused, tied to that business objective, what I want to do is create a bit of separation and make it very clear that the second business objective, the revenue loss due to lack of stock, is really its own distinct story. So we could do something like this. We could use that enclosure concept again and drop in the table of products with no stock, pull in that KPI card with lost revenue, since again, that ties directly to our second business objective. So now we're starting to look really good, but we're not quite done. The final step here is to actually tell a story. So we're still using kind of these default out of the box chart titles that don't really craft a narrative. So one of the simplest and most effective things that we can do is replace those default titles with meaningful descriptive text and use things like font color and emphasis and styling to help users quickly interpret what they're looking at. So here's an example of what that might look like. Now, instead of just feeling like a report, it reads like a story. How did the region perform in September 2021? This is how much revenue we generated. This is the revenue split by product category, where these products drove the increases and decreases in revenue. It's so clear, it's so easy to follow, and it's such a great way to help your end users and stakeholders cut to the chase and get the exact information they need. Now, of course, final step here would be to tie it all up with a few specific insights and recommendations. Maybe we launch new product offerings similar to Play Foam. Maybe we get rid of Rubik's Cubes. You get an example of what I mean here. But hopefully that gives you a really good, really clear example of what that dashboard design process looks like from start to finish. So I'll wrap with some very quick key takeaways. Remember, data viz is the graphical representation of data and information. Storytelling is about crafting narratives to communicate insight, influence decisions, and support data-driven recommendations. Always try to consider the 3 key questions. What data are you working with? What are you trying to communicate? And who's your audience? What do they need? And then remember these common mistakes: choosing the wrong chart, failing to focus, adding clutter and noise, and prioritizing form over function. And finally, context is key. It's what gives numbers meaning and what helps users interpret them accurately. So I hope you found that helpful. If you want to dive deeper, if you love data viz like I do, we have an entire learning path. It's our data visualization expert path that goes into Excel, Power BI, and Tableau. or if you want to dig into individual courses, Enrique has a fantastic advanced Excel dashboard design course. We do a ton of dashboard and report building in my Power BI desktop course. Dustin has a great Tableau desktop course and an advanced version as well. And if you're a Python guy, check out Chris Brule's Data Viz with Matplotlib and Seaborn course as well. So that's it from me. Again, hopefully that was helpful. And John, I don't know if we've got a few minutes for questions or if we're right at time.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's pull up some of the most upvoted questions here. Hey there, hope you're enjoying the video. Sorry to interrupt. We'll get you right back to it. Right now, Maven Analytics is offering a deal that was just too big not to share it with you. We've got an early Black Friday sale, and you can save up to 50% off of Maven Analytics paid plans. So if you've been considering learning Excel, SQL, Power BI, Python, Tableau, and everything else that you need to become a data analyst or accelerate your career, now is the perfect time. Check it out at mavenanalytics.io. You can see the Black Friday offer in the banner at the top of the screen. You can't miss it. Again, if you're on the fence, there's never been a better time. We don't do a lot of these sales, so I hope that some people will take advantage. Now, enjoy the video. I'll let you get back to it. Thanks. So this one's from Mohammed. How do you balance the trade-off between simplifying complex data and maintaining the accuracy and depth of information? So how do you kind of find that balance, Chris?
Oh, man. You're starting with a tough question.
Yeah.
It's a really good one, though. I have to say it always comes back to knowing your audience, right? And there are going to be audiences who appreciate and need that level of detail, in which case showing something like, a box and whisker plot that has tons of information and detail packed into it is important. But I think a really common mistake that analysts tend to make is thinking that we have to share all the detail with our stakeholders every time. We have to talk about the model behind it, how it's built, what parameters we tuned, and all this, when really most stakeholders at the end of the day just care about the so what, right? So I think that trade-off can be tough, but I would urge you to be disciplined about focusing on the so what, and then kind of keeping those detail and that really granular view in your back pocket to address any kind of questions or concerns or detail as it comes up. But lead with simplicity, lead with the so what. What's the outcome? How is your analysis going to change your stakeholders' life or the decisions that they're making? I think that's the simplest way I could answer that one.
Amazing answer. Let's see. So here's another one from Dahlia. Dahlia says, how would we select colors if the company doesn't have established brand colors? How would you think about that, Chris?
Yeah, so I generally hate the default colors that most of these tools give you. They're really bright, they're really bold. I like to use a more muted palette, which doesn't distract from the data itself. There's some really great palette designers out there, and if anyone knows them off the top of your head, drop them in the chat. I can't remember the exact ones, but use muted colors and keep it to a relatively small palette, no more than 3 or 4 shades. And that's going to make sure that you're not overwhelming the user with too much color or colors that are too bright or too loud.
Awesome. Yeah. And people are dropping a bunch of really good resources in the chat. So check those out.
Yeah. Coolers.co. That was one that I've heard about. People love.
Awesome. Let's see. How about what questions should you ask in a client interview during the requirements gathering before you start building? What would you ask your stakeholders up front?
Yeah. So what I'll say is go check out John Poller's measurement planning section of the Thinking Like an Analyst course. That's where we go into this stuff in depth because it's really important. Again, I talked about empathy, right? Understanding what your stakeholder cares about, putting yourself in the stakeholder's shoes is so critical to conducting a meaningful analysis. So I think the types of questions to ask are things like, what business goals does this analysis align with? What does success look like? How would you define, what a successful outcome is, and which metrics can I help you use to measure that? And then it's kind of your job, once you've understood the overarching why, to get tactical and understand, okay, to address that why, I'm going to need these data sets, these metrics. I'm going to present it in this way. That's your job as the analyst. But I think centering the conversation on that bigger picture is really critical in those early conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that will, as you get more seasoned and as you get more familiar with your specific business, this will come more naturally. And like, it'll be, at the beginning of your career, you might be asking a lot of questions. And then later on, you might be sort of coming with some proposed solutions and saying, hey, VP of marketing, VP of operations, here's what I think you should be looking at. How does this sound? What do you think? And it kind of becomes more of a discussion the further along you get. Let's take one more. Let me pick a really good one. All right, here's one from Vasilis. How can someone become a better data storyteller? Data visualization is an ongoing learning process, but which features should we focus on most to be the most effective? Again, that's
I was just looking at that question too. It's a good pick. Awesome question. The short answer is tune in for Christopher Chin's session later today. He is he's amazing at this, and this really is his sweet spot. There's a whole art to storytelling that goes beyond even the topics that I covered today, right? And things like how much text do you put on a slide? How do you package the information in a way that like demands and captures the audience's attention and keeps them engaged and makes your case in the most clear and powerful way that you possibly can. Along with the things that I did talk about, like choosing the right visuals, simplifying the story, making sure you're crafting a narrative and not just dumping data on the screen, tailoring it to your audience. This is like one of those key intersections of art and science where it takes practice and it takes reps and it takes a really deep understanding of your audience to do it well. But I'm going to be watching Christopher's session later today, so I'd encourage you guys to tune in as well.
Yeah, he's awesome. Well, Chris, thank you so much for doing this. This was amazing. Hey there, I hope you enjoyed this video. This was part of our open campus event where we ran 24 sessions in front of a live audience over the course of 2 weeks. It was a ton of fun. We did all these live sessions and we opened up our entire learning platform for free. You did not need a paid account to take advantage of all the courses. So folks could learn Excel, SQL, Power BI, Tableau, Python, etc. All the stuff that you need to learn data analysis skills and take your career to the next level. If you missed it this year, keep an eye out. We'll definitely be doing this again next year, probably again in October. We would love to see you there. And the last thing that I'll leave you with, if you're looking to take your skills to the next level right now and you've been on the fence about a Maven Analytics paid plan, we are currently running our early Black Friday sale. This is the absolute best time to pay for Maven Analytics if you want to, so don't miss out. You'll have the opportunity to save up to 50% on paid plans, which is a pretty great opportunity. You can check out all the details at mavenanalytics.io. Just look for the early Black Friday banner at the top of the site. You can't miss it. Hope that we'll see some of you there as well. Thanks for watching.